To display data in your report, you'll need one or more data sources. A data source is a connection string. The content of the string depends on the data provider that you use. For example, a connection string for a SQL Server database looks different from a connection string used to connect to a Sharepoint list. The purpose of the connection string is to describe where to find the data, what format it's in, and depending upon the data provider that you're using, the connection string also might include the credentials to use for authentication. In reporting services, the data source file also specifies the authentication method to use when establishing the connection. You need to specify whether the report uses Windows authentication to pass through the current user's credentials, or whether to use a hard-coded value for the username and password, which doesn't have to exist in the connection string. You can also configure the dataset to prompt the user to first enter credentials before executing the report. Or you can specify that no credentials at all are required. Unless the data source has no security defined, which is highly unusual, the credentials are used by the data source to authenticate the user before the query executes. Because of this, the user account must have at least reader permissions on the data source. There are many different types of data sources that reporting services supports. Probably the most common type of data that you'll use in reports is relational data. As you can see in this list, reporting services supports a wide range of relational data sources. And if your relational database isn't listed here explicitly, you can probably access it using the OLADB or ODBC data providers. You can also use multidimensional data in your reports using any of these data providers. XML is also an option. And accessing a Sharepoint list as a data source is a new feature of SQL Server 2008 R2. When you add a data source to the project, it's stored as an RDS file, and the contents are actually comprised of XML data, as you can see here. The key elements in this file are the extension and connect string. You can produce this file using the data source dialog box in the report designer, or you can manually or even programmatically produce the file. It doesn't really matter how you create it, as long as it has the right structure, as shown here. There are two different types of data sources. Typically, you create a shared data source to define the connection information once for use with many reports. If connection information changes later, such as when you move a source database to a different server, an administrator can update the data source definition once, and then all of the associated reports will get their data from the correct location. Your other option is an embedded data source. In that case, you don't create a separate data source file, but you create a data source definition inside of each report's RDL file. The advantage of using an embedded data source is that you can use dynamic connection strings, but the disadvantage is that if you need to make a change to the connection string, you'll need to open every report and edit the connection string there, which can be a very tedious process if you have a lot of reports.